Hey everyone! Thanks for checking out my latest retrospective. If you're new to my channel, I do a bunch of retrospectives on different years of console releases, but sometimes I really like to get into narrative-heavy franchises and go through that stuff. It's actually one of my favorite things to do. I don't have the time to do it as often as I would like, but whenever the opportunity presents itself, I really like to dig into these franchises I love so much. If you're a fan of our channel, then you know we typically like to cover Japanese content. That's just where the idea came from and kind of what we stuck to, and is what I'm really interested in. So I don't really dive into these big Western franchises, though I'd like to. But now we're getting an opportunity to look at something that I really didn't think I would ever cover. And it's something that I really loved when I was a teenager and saw the first movie and it blew me away. And, I was in the middle of a Dot Hat series retrospective I was writing. I was planning on an FF7 retrospective, and then, that game got postponed, so that'll be out sometime soon. But, this week, the latest Blair Witch game is coming out, and I'm way more excited for it than I ever thought I would be. So I dived into the franchise like never before, and I knew about the movies and, some of the lore books, but I was not prepared for everything that had come out. I thought I was a decent fan of this franchise, but I was overwhelmed with how much else I didn't know about. And there's a lot to go through, so I'm going to do kind of what I did with my Kingdom Hearts video. I'm going to do this episode just explaining all the media for people who are interested in what came out in this franchise, and then I'm going to dive into lore-specific episodes. So if you don't really want to dive into this stuff and just want to know the story before you play the new game, you can totally check that out, and if you get interested in it, go check out some of this media, because it's really interesting. And like the Kingdom Hearts retrospective, and like I'm going to do with some of the other narrative retrospectives I've got coming up, I'm going to put together a Blair Witch prize pack and, have a contest at the end of this. So, if you're interested in this stuff, stay tuned for that. Let's dive right into it. I think the first thing to cover off is, of course, right in the middle here, the Blair Witch itself, the original movie that started it all. I've got 3 versions of it on this table. I've got the Blu-ray, which of course I prefer. I've got the DVD release, and I've got the kind of 2-pack. I picked up a couple doubles when I knew I was going to do this retrospective, to give away as part of the prize pack I mentioned earlier. So yeah, that's why I got some doubles on this table. But let's get right into this. This movie blew me away. I was in high school when this came out, and I was really into horror movies at the time. So it's not that it was so scary to me, it's just that it was such an impressive, just a really cool story that just so many interesting things about how this movie was made, how they promoted it, just all kinds of really neat stuff to know about this franchise. The movie itself was a real indie surprise hit. Written, directed, and edited by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, who wrote a pretty short script that just kind of outlined some of the events that would happen in the movie, and then they hired actors to kind of, mess with them and see how they would react to the different events they set up. And they made this fake documentary that, if the shaky cam didn't make you sick at the time, it really provided a compelling and interesting story, and the way they marketed it was something else, and we'll get to that in a bit, but yeah. The original movie, definitely worth watching if you can kind of stomach that shaky cam. I'm sure it's not the first use of shaky cam, but it is, I think, the first movie that really, the whole movie was done like this and was done in a way to make you think that this was real documentary footage and not something that was, written and produced. So, a very interesting use of that. There's so much of that out now. It's kind of a shame, that Paranormal Activity can get 6 sequels, but, the Blair Witch franchise seems to get its legs taken out from under it every chance it gets. It just never gets that chance to really be the big franchise it deserves. And I'm not talking bad about other horror franchises, but they're good too, but they go for, 6, 9 movies, and, Blair Witch hasn't gotten any of that despite what an interesting story it is. I'm not trying to collect everything like I typically do when I go crazy in my collecting. I don't have the VHS tapes. I did have those when I was younger, but yeah, this isn't a franchise I think I need to own everything for. But it is cool to have kind of one version of each piece of media here. So with that, let's talk about The Curse of the Blair Witch, which I don't have on this table. I kind of do because it's included in special features here on the, DVD and Blu-ray version of the Blair Witch Project. That was a short that was produced for, I believe, Sci-Fi Channel that told the backstory of this movie, and it really helped develop the lore and really made a compelling argument for, this could be real. At the time, the internet was still kind of new. It wasn't that easy to research what was real and what wasn't. And this sci-fi special made the case that all of this stuff really happened. It's where a lot of the lore comes from. It was released on VHS as well. That came bundled with the Blair Witch Project on release. But yeah, like I said, it's in the DVD versions now, so worth checking out. So if you're going to watch the Blair Witch Project and haven't seen it before, make sure you watch that too. It's where all that crazy marketing I was telling you about comes from. It's not just that movie. There was a website set up. There were other TV specials. There were just things to really try and make this seem like a real story. So when people left the theaters, they didn't know if it was real or fake. A lot of people actually did get suckered and believed it was real. It sparked a whole lot of unwanted tourism to Burkittsville, which, that's pretty funny and a subject of one of the later movies. You kind of had to be there. It's so hard to imagine now that, this little indie movie comes out, tricks a whole bunch of people into thinking it's real, inspires a whole bunch of other shaky cam fake documentaries. It was such a big deal at the time. I don't know if I can quite get that across. But yeah, that's why I love this franchise. So yeah, this is the movie that started it all. But before I get to everything else on this table, I want to talk a little bit about the canon, because it's actually a really interesting case. So the two filmmakers that made the first movie, they were involved with some of the stuff on this table, and that's considered primary canon. Everything that they kind of had a say in, or gave their blessing to, that stuff is definitely canon. Unless they've retconned it, which is, there's one case of that I'll get to in the lore videos. Then there's secondary canon. These are things that, the studio had produced just to help build this franchise and keep this franchise going. A lot of this stuff didn't have the input of the original creators. Most of the stuff here is part of that canon. So the way I handle that is to look at it as, this stuff is kind of canon, unless it's officially retconned in later primary sources, and who knows how many more of those we're going to get. And what's really interesting about this canon is that because everything in this franchise pretends to be real, pretends like these things really happened, and all this stuff is, stories that people are telling, I consider the third level to be a kind of fictional canon. And that's where things that are secondary canon that have been, disavowed, those things kind of become fictional canon. And the way I look at that is these are things that people who, they want to play hoaxes, they want to, be part of the Blair Witch legend, they just want to get, something out of tricking people. So they put out these kind of red herrings, these fake stories, or maybe they were crazy and they really believed it was real and attributed their craziness to the Blair Witch, but really that wasn't the case. So that's the way I look at a lot of this canon, which is really neat because everything is supposed to take place in the real world. It's nice that everything can fit into that canon. It's really up to you to decide what you think is real and what you think is BS. With that in mind, let's go back for a second. There was one other VHS tape that came out, another TV special, Sticks and Stones. And that was basically just kind of a recut of Curse of the Blair Witch with a little bit of extra footage. I think there may have been a deleted scene from the movie in there. Nothing you need to see, but it's worth noting that, that came out and you can buy that VHS online. It's just wicked expensive, but I think it was a Blockbuster exclusive, and I bet at that time when they were clearing that stuff out, they couldn't even give it away. So just to mention it, obviously not on this table, but the BlairWitch.com website I mentioned earlier. You can't find the original version online anymore, but you can find it through the Wayback Machine. If you go through archive.org, you can check out all the original stuff that was there. A lot of the information that's there has been reprinted in other things, so I don't know if you really need to check it out, but if you, get really into this stuff, that's a place to go. There was also a photo novel book, which I've never seen. I don't know if it's got any lore in it or if it's just kind of pictures or stills from the movie. But yeah, that's an interesting thing to know about. If I ever get the chance to check it out, I will. And there was also a soundtrack, I believe it was called Josh's Blair Witch Mix. If you're into the music, I guess, or if you're into music inspired by the movie, I'm not quite sure what's on that, but yeah, worth knowing about. So with that, let's get into the next piece of primary canon, and that is the Blair Witch Project Dossier, written by D.A. Stern. Now, actually, I don't know who D.A. Stern is. He writes a lot of this stuff. I don't know if it's a pen name. I don't know if it's all written by the same person even. But yeah, that's cool because it's a character, basically. There's a character in the Blair Witch universe called D.A. Stern who did a bunch of research, who was apparently, really into folklore. That was his thesis, and has become kind of the expert on Blair Witch stuff. And so he puts out all of these books about the Blair Witch. And the Dossier is one that had a lot of input from the original creators, and goes through a whole lot of stuff. Not as much information as you would like, but definitely some clarifications. It's almost kind of like a sequel to Curse of the Blair Witch, or sequel to the original movie, in that it tells the story of the three kids' parents hiring investigators to try and figure out what happened to their kids. And this whole thing reads like a report of their findings. There's interviews in here, there's historical information and articles, there's some really interesting theories that they discounted about what could have happened to the kids if it wasn't supernatural. A whole bunch of cool stuff if you're into the franchise, though not quite any of the answers you would want. Roughly the same time that came out, we got the Blair Witch comic, a one-shot comic. This is the special edition. They only made, I think, 8,000 copies. Came with a certificate. But yeah, this comic itself has its own really interesting backstory they wrote for it, where a character named Cece Malvey goes into the woods and the witch tells him a whole bunch of stories, and it kind of makes him crazy. He makes his own really rough indie comic and tries to sell it, and that's the inspiration that they use for the stories that they tell here. They take some of his words exactly as he wrote them in his original comic, and there are some pages reprinted from that. And of course, as far as I know, that original comic does not exist. That was just backstory that was written for these comics. And each of the kind of short stories in that comic book tell a different part of the Blair Witch legend. There's one that tells the past of Ellie Kedward, the witch. There's one that tells a little bit about the story of the drowning at the Tapley Creek, and there's a little bit about Rust and Parr. So that kind of stuff did not have the original creators consulted on it much, as far as I know. It's considered secondary canon, and the important stuff that you would care about, the kind of backstory of the Blair Witch, that's already been retconned by a primary source, which is the Trial of Ellie Kedward, which has already retconned itself. An original version of the Trial of Ellie Kedward website, elliekedward.com, told Ellie's backstory, a pretty horrific one. We'll get into that in the next lore video. And then that's just been retconned last year with a new web series that's now at elliekedward.com that apparently tells the real story. So yeah, check out that web series if you're interested in this at all. Shortly after that, they published 4 other comic books called the Blair Witch Chronicles, and those are collected here in this trade paperback, which is rare and hard to find, but I got it for dirt cheap because I think the seller didn't post any pictures. No one knew if it was a single issue or a graphic novel. I took the chance on it, and yeah, I got this for like $10. This has the original comic book in it, as well as the 4 Blair Witch Chronicles comics. So these all tell different stories in the Blair Witch universe. Again, not canon. They're either secondary or fictional canon, but definitely interesting. I have no idea when these came out. I had no idea these existed. I didn't even read about them online. But randomly, I was at Con Bravo, a couple months ago, and some table that was selling old trading cards had 10 packs of these, and I knew I was doing this retrospective, so I couldn't help but pick them up. And yeah, these are just the Blair Witch trading cards. I don't know why anyone would actually want to trade these. I guess the cards are kind of interesting in that there's art or stills from the movie on one side, and then facts or information on the back. So again, if you're really into Blair Witch lore and we're hoping for some kind of more information, I'm sure that's why you picked these up at the time. There's 72 cards in the set. I didn't quite do the math, but it seems like you'd have to buy quite a few packs to get them all. There's 5 rare cards and the rest are common. So, even with 10 packs, I didn't have all of the common cards and I didn't get a single rare. So yeah, I expect you'd have to buy at least 50 packs to get that. Thankfully, they were super cheap, and that's why I got them. But yeah, at the time, for full price, I can't imagine trying to get this whole set. So almost everything else on this table came out in 2000. So that's, the Blair Witch Project came out in 99. This is all 2 years worth of stuff, except for this one thing, which we'll get to at the end. But yeah, just a crazy amount of time to pump out all of this stuff. Obviously, the franchise was a hit. Obviously, they were trying to capitalize on it. Let's see, what do we get to next? The Blair Witch games. I had and played these when I was in high school, and I loved them. They are really broken. Like, even back then, these games ran terribly. But I was so into survival horror, I didn't care. They are completely fictional. I mean, I like to pretend that the creators researched the Blair Witch history and tried to sprinkle some facts into it. But yeah, this stuff can't fit into canon well at all. I mean, they could make it fit into canon later, but I don't think they're going to bother with too much of that. We'll see. There's 3 games. I think they were all developed by different teams and probably all used the same engine, at least a similar engine. Like I said, they're all really buggy. They do still run on today's computers. You have to tweak the settings a bit and pick the right compatibility mode, but I got them all to run. The first one is actually pretty hilarious in its own right because the original developer had a game called Nocturne, I believe, which was a survival horror game. And obviously you could tell they rushed this because this is basically a sequel to that game. The characters from that game are the main characters in this game. In that one, they're a secret part of the FBI or CIA that's hunting vampires. In this game, those same characters are investigating the Blair Witch and the Rustin Parr incident. The second game was the Legend of Coffin Rock. Again, very similar, but this one did away with those original characters. Instead, it grounded itself more in the mythology and pretended to be a little more true to the source material. The third one is the Ellie Kedward tale, which actually doesn't really say much about Ellie Kedward at all. It's a priest who's a witch hunter who's investigating what's going on in Blair after Ellie Kedward was killed and tries to figure out what's going on there. Since I'm talking about the games, I might as well bring up this, the Blair Witch Experience box I found for like $15 at a used shop. This thing is pretty cool. It comes with the DVDs for Blair Witch 1 and 2. It comes with a 3-pack of the 3 games. And it comes with a little Blair Witch necklace, which is kind of neat, although I don't think I could ever wear this out, unless I'm going to some goth club or something. But yeah, it's just a cool box. And I think the Blair Witch games, I don't know, you can't really get them digitally, I don't think. And I'm not sure how widely available they are. Obviously, the prices on eBay are pretty high, but I don't know if that's reflective of what they're really worth. Regardless, for like $15 to get all 3 included in this box set is kind of neat. So the next set of things tried to throw a twist into the narrative. The Rustin Parr story that's carried across a lot of the media we've already talked about, that Rustin Parr killed a bunch of kids under the witch's influence, that got thrown for a bit of a loop with D.A. Stern's Blair Witch, the secret confession of Rustin Parr. And this book came out around the same time as Blair Witch Dark Testaments, a one-shot that also talks a bit about Rustin Parr stuff, and another TV special called The Burkittsville 7. That is available on VHS along with another TV special we'll talk about in a bit, but that tape is even harder to find. I believe it was another Blockbuster exclusive. But yeah, this confession book tries to turn the story on its head and say that Rustin Parr wasn't the one who actually killed the kids. Instead, it was the sole survivor of that incident. So we'll dive into that, into the lore later. This is all secondary canon, so it's really up to you to decide if you think that's the case based on the material presented, or if you stick with the original creator's intent, which I believe is just that Rustin Parr was the killer. Before we get to the next obvious thing to talk about, let's talk about this, which I never knew existed. I was wicked happy to find out it did and get them. That is the Blair Witch Files, a 8-part young adult novel series. I don't know where you would have got this, maybe out of Scholastic or something. But yeah, just 8 books that each cover a different kind of mystery that may have had to do with the Blair Witch. and they each tell a really different story. They each try and expose a different part of the narrative. There's some crazy stuff in here. There's some interesting stuff. The overall premise is what I really like about it. They introduce this character, who's also credited as the author of the book, Cade Merrill. He is Heather's cousin, and after the events of the first movie, he opens up a Blair Witch Experience website and starts taking information from people to try and get more information about his missing cousin. And that's where these cases all come from. So they all are written by him. It's him taking his investigation and his research that he's done, the stories people tell him, and he tries to put them together in a simple to read narrative format that tells a story of the Blair Witch. And this is all secondary canon. None of it really gets touched on anywhere else. It does pretty interestingly touch a lot of the other aspects of the lore. Some of it is a bit too far, a bit too crazy. Specifically, night shifters, where there's a cult of people that turn into animals. But, actually this book I had to order it 3 times. Every time I ordered it, the person who was selling it was like, oh, we don't have it anymore. And it's like the most expensive, which was surprising. But yeah, just a crazy book. They're not super important to the lore yet, but they are interesting, and I really like that idea of this character. I actually kind of hope we see him in something in the future, because I think, we have seen it before. People go into the woods unprepared. Other movies do the same thing. Paranormal Activity, they got worse and worse at fighting the ghosts throughout the series. Here's someone, Cade Merrill, D.A. Stern too. These are people who have been researching the Blair Witch for a while, who know about the occult a bit, and these are people I think could be interesting protagonists. So, maybe if this upcoming game takes off, we might see them do more, and maybe someone will dive into the secondary canon and elevate it. With that, let's get to the thing that killed the franchise. 2 years of all this stuff, and this comes out and just disappointed everyone. Blair Witch 2, Book of Shadows. As one of my favorite internet comments puts it, there is no Blair Witch in this movie, and there is no Book of Shadows. Now, I sound really down on this movie. I was really down on it when it came out. It is the most disappointing thing to follow up the original Blair Witch project. It wasn't a fake documentary. It was just a whole other movie that had a lot of references to the original movie, but pretended that the original movie itself was fiction. It may be the only piece of media in the whole franchise that doesn't pretend that the original Blair Witch project was real and really happened. And I've actually come around on it recently. Watching it again, it's actually a very cool movie. It's a good movie. It's just a terrible Blair Witch movie. It kind of reminds me of that, like Halloween 3, It's just a completely different thing, so everyone wrote it off, myself included, but pretty decent on its own. And if you have any interest in watching it again, if you've seen it before or if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check out the director's commentary that's on there, because the film creator goes through his entire process of what he did and why he did it and what the studio changed. And it really tells a story of something that could have been a really cool movie. What he was trying to do was so far ahead of its time, in my opinion. It kind of reminds me of like Metal Gear Solid 2. I know that's a strange comparison, but I think there's some parallels there if you care to look for them. It is really interesting. This thing, it bombed so bad that we never got a Blu-ray release even of this, and people just hate on it. The cut is, I think it's a shame, because I think that the way the studio cut the movie made it the worst of both cases. It was always a terrible Blair Witch movie, but now it doesn't even succeed at what it was trying to do, which is... So I guess I'll just get into it now, since, it's not lore, so I'm not going to get into it in the lore video, but the studio, basically they hired a real documentary maker who had gone into the woods researching real serial killers, and so they thought, on paper, this guy is the best guy to do a Blair Witch follow-up. But writing and directing the next Blair Witch, he didn't want to do a fake documentary. He wanted to do something completely different. And the one thing he really took exception to in the first movie is how they tried to trick people. And he really saw a problem with showing people something and telling them it's real when it's not real. And so he based this whole movie around what's real and what isn't. Why should you believe something for being real just because it's being shown to you? And that is a really interesting narrative that is more compelling today, I would say, than ever before. So definitely interesting. Terrible Blair Witch sequel, like I said, but even though they wrecked the original intention, the studio did everything they could to try and bring this film back into the Blair Witch mythology. Yeah, so they added a screen telling people that, hey, this isn't a documentary, but this is a fictionalized version of events that really happened. So you know, this is real actors. Michael Weston from Burn Notice, which is awesome to see him in here. I had no idea until I watched it again recently. He's great. Everyone in it is great. But yeah, these people are actors retelling events that happened in real life, apparently. And to go along with that, they put out another TV special, Shadow of the Blair Witch. And this is available on that VHS tape with the Burkittsville 7. And this tells the real life, story that supposedly happened, where, I won't spoil it in case you do want to see it, or I'll spoil it in the lore videos later, but the original movie always tried to be like, hey, was it supernatural? Were they just crazy people? But yeah, they try to make it lean a bit more to the supernatural side. And one thing I don't have on this table, I'm waiting for it to come. Almost all of these books came from the UK. I guess the UK, the Blair Witch was just way more popular over there. But yeah, a lot of this stuff came from the UK. And the last thing I don't have on this table, because I'm still waiting for it to come, is actually the Blair Witch Book of Shadows dossier, I guess you'd call it. Which is, again, by D.A. Stern, another dossier that covers the background of the second movie. So I'm interested to see if there's anything in there that I didn't get from, the movie itself and the special Shadow of the Blair Witch. But yeah, we'll see. And with that, let's get to the last thing on this table. After years of the franchise being dead, we got Blair Witch, the third movie in the series. After many attempts to get Blair Witch 3 into production, they eventually got this one going with the writers and directors of some pretty good horror movies for the time. Most notably, I think You're Next, and some segments of the VHS movie series. The movie tries to breathe new life into the franchise. Some of the choices they made upset some fans, I think. They showed a bit too much, but also didn't answer quite enough. I know that's a bit of a, contradictory statement, but that totally describes what the movie tells. And they clearly had a plan to make more movies in the franchise, but this one bombed too, I think, which is kind of a shame because I actually kind of like it. I think it's a pretty good follow-up to the original movie, and I think that some of the things that people may find a bit silly, like the monster in it, may have been explained to a more satisfactory extent in sequels. But yeah, that's the last thing we got, and now we are getting the Blair Witch game coming out on Friday by the Layers of Fear developers. I never really got into Layers of Fear, but I've heard people really do love it, so I'm interested to see what they do with the franchise. What's interesting is the time that that game takes place, which is, I believe, just 2 years after the events of the first movie, but before that footage has been found. So it's going to be interesting to see a world where, a lot of this Blair Witch stuff hasn't happened or isn't known. It may be weird, though, to have events happen in this game that are never referenced again in later stuff. So I hope this game does well. I hope it, manages to kick off the franchise again. I'm excited to check it out. And so, yeah, if you're interested in this stuff, stay tuned for my lore retrospectives. I'm going to cover all the details of the series yeah, I'm going to get back to my usual content soon. I got other retrospectives coming up, console retrospectives, and I'll get to that .hack one soon, as well as Final Fantasy VII I really want to do. And so yeah, thanks for checking out this video. Subscribe for more stuff to stay notified, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!